Today we wanted to talk about wage theft and about sort of the overarching themes that El Centro Humanitario, which is the provider of the food, and many other very wonderful things in the community that have to do with day labor, wage theft, and I'm going to let Marco Nunez describe that. And Marco is going to start, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what our committee from First Unitarian has been doing to try and get people paid who have been victims of wage theft. And then we have Daniel Playwitter with us too from Fresk, and I'm going to let you just tell them when you come up more about Fresk, who's going to help us understand the larger picture and how systemic this problem is of wage theft. So let me just turn it over to Marco.
Sounds great. So thanks again for having me here. I recognize a lot of you. It's nice to be part of a united front on a number of different issues. Wage theft to me is one of the most pressing issues, not just because of my professional orientation, being director at Centro Humanitario and seeing it every day, but because increasingly I began to reflect on just how profound this affects folks, right? The folks that are most susceptible to wage theft, when you really think about it, are riding a razor's edge already, right? Barely making a payment for that house or the apartment or the car, the insurance. And so any disruption to that flow of income can have significant effects on folks. In fact, Chris and compañeros might share in a little bit Alex's story, right? He's an individual who lost his car, right? After at least 2 different pay periods where he wasn't paid, right? And so you think about how dependent folks are. The thing about wage theft that is remarkably infuriating to me is that wage theft by definition is money that you're not paid for work that you have already done. So it's infuriating to me when you think about that very simple covenant, right? I don't think there's a better word for it, right? I'm gonna afford you my time, my energy, right? And in exchange, the way it works in our economy, in exchange, you're gonna pay me for it. Doesn't matter if you're an accountant, a lawyer, doesn't matter if you're digging a hole for a fence, right? It's a pretty straightforward understanding and transaction. And so we're here to talk about folks in situations where this is done deliberately. And we're not talking about the casual mistake that an accountant makes, though there are huge systemic errors that an accountant can make for a corporation that can affect a lot of workers. But I think in our experience, we're not talking about those, although those are just as important. You may have seen in the news, Walmart, Target, these big box stores that had been fined in court and had to pay millions of dollars. Walmart was one of the most notable cases where they had a standing practice of asking folks to clock out. And after they clocked out, they would say, well, we just got a new freighter in, right? Can you guys just help us, right? Be part of the team, unload, right, the semi with us. Well, it was happening so systematically throughout the country that, there were class action lawsuits that were filed against Walmart. They were found guilty of that. You can apply that sort of example to the restaurant industry, where even throughout the restaurant industry, there are managers that don't pay workers. The difference between I think it's about $4 an hour, and then the difference with minimum wage is $7.75. If they don't make that difference up in their tips, they should be paid by the restaurant that difference, right? Again, we're talking about folks trying to survive, but yet systemically we've seen restaurants that have not paid, not even the minimum wage. So wage theft, a lot of you know what it is. It's just a non-payment of wages, right? Either minimum wage, not payment of overtime, and again, the kind of cases that we see is just outright non-payment. Some for up to two months worth of work. And I think sometimes I've come across folks that have asked me, how is it that a person is willing to work 2 months and not be paid? Shouldn't they know better? Shouldn't they just stop working if they're not getting paid? Well, yeah, and that's what ends up happening, right? To me, 2 months seems like the threshold when people were like, this is, they're not gonna pay me, I'm gonna stop working. But the way that it gets to 2 months, we have seen, is that employers will dangle this carrot in front of them and say, we're gonna get that payment next week, just hang on. Or that payment is just a little bit late, so hang on. But then by about 2 months, roughly, is when somebody just gets wise and says enough is enough. In the case of some hotel workers, I think it was something about maybe 3 to 6 weeks. No, maybe it was 3 weeks. It was about 3 weeks when initially it was underpayment, and then it was non-payment. And then that's when they said enough's enough. Or we just don't think we're going to get paid anymore. So I think today's presentation, quickly, we're going to talk about a couple of levels. Just one, I want to just delve a little bit more into a couple of stories. And then I want to talk a little bit about what is being done on an individual case-by-case basis to help workers get recourse. And then Daniel, again, will talk more systemically about what can be done to address this. So, I come in with a deep sense of humility about this issue because sometimes it's suffocating when you think about how many people are victims of wage theft and how many cases can we help resolve all at once. I think all of us are hungry to get as many cases to take on as we can. And in the course of the year and a half we've been at Centro, I'm learning a lot. What we want to get Centro to a place of is to be able to resolve these cases informally. So let me show you all something. When we're talking about resolution, is that when we look at this chart here, a victim of wage theft has a number of paths that he or she can take. On the far left, an individual can go the private route, right? And the private route, you can go and hire an attorney. Oftentimes, an attorney doesn't want to take a case for something that's, say, $300, like one pay period, right? The attorney's thinking, well, what am I going to get back out of this? Is it worth my time and energy and so forth? Another route that an individual can take is to go the government route. If the employer makes less than or has earnings of less than $500,000, this individual likely would go to the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. If the employer is big enough, then this and/or employer participates in intrastate commerce, this victim of wage theft can go to the Federal Department of Labor. Right? So these are two different agencies. Nonetheless, it is somewhat cumbersome. So then they'll take the case, and they start investigating and so forth. I would say the State Department of Labor has much less enforcement power than the Federal Department of Labor, right? And unfortunately, the majority of cases that we see fall under the jurisdiction of the State Department of Labor. I'll get into that in a bit. Another path that an individual could take is to go visit a place like Centro Humanitario and Centro Amistad, right? And other places throughout, there are very few places, but other nonprofits. And so these nonprofits do what they can to try to intervene with employers, right? Call them directly, send them a letter, and so forth. And then lastly, the individual can try and take matters into their own hands and say, well, I'm going to go to small claims court. There was an individual last year, Jose, right? Last year, we're talking about 9 months, 10 months ago, when we first began to explore taking the case to small claims. And it has taken 9, 10 months for this individual to feel comfortable with the orientation of what it may take to even go to small claims, to learn it, think about what the case might be, right? So I want to just step back for a second here and just think about our own privilege here and what it would mean to navigate small claims. It seems, in theory, simple enough. I don't need an attorney. If right is on my side, I'm going to go stand in front of a judge and make my case, right? Here's what I've done. Here's the house that I built. He hasn't paid me. Judge, will you tell him to pay me? Sounds easy enough to me. But I think what we're learning is for folks, again, when we think about the disproportionate, the population that is most disproportionately affected by wage theft, this is an onerous, intimidating, confusing, and challenging prospect. So in some regard, I think our work with Jose is an interesting case study for us Because as Jose is navigating this small claims court, I think we get to observe from the outside how in the future can we help mitigate some of the barriers that folks come across. Do we offer more orientations at Centro Humanitario about small claims? Do we invite a small claims judge over to Centro? Do we take people to small claims and go observe as a group so we can begin to dispel, right, some of the myths around how daunting it is and such. The last thing I'd say about small claims, which is challenging, two more things I'm going to reflect on. Every one of these paths has advantages and then limitations. For small claims, a huge limitation is that even if right is on your side, and even if the judge sides with you, it then falls on your shoulder to go to the person who's not paying you and collect. So you're almost back at square one, except you have a nice letter signed by a judge that says you should pay me. So I'm going and I'm knocking at your door and saying, hey, remember me? First you didn't pay me, and then I called you 50 times, and you still didn't pay me, and then I took you to court, and now I have this letter. Are you going to pay me now? Right? So we come across individuals like, hell no, I'm not paying you still. Right? Get off my property. I don't think we have a standing ground law in Colorado. It's such a frightening law, right? So that's a huge challenge and limitation around small claims. Enough, if you look at all of these, and Daniel will talk about the systemic response to some of this stuff, but every one of these have just enough obstacles or disincentives to dissuade folks from even trying. Because it's easier, not easier, I would say, it's necessary for a lot of these folks. Again, the folks that are most vulnerable to wage theft, low income, Spanish speaking immigrant, right? And so what we end up finding is the default ends up being, just let it go. Right? I have to go find that other job to survive. I gotta go hustle, right? And so they dismiss it. And that's the very thing that employers can count on, right? Is that sort of despair. So what we try to do as Centro then is we try to intervene in saying, okay, for us it's been an evolution. We have refined our model where we have a nonprofit that happens to be like, they happen to be attorneys, and they now receive all of our cases. Right? And in receiving the cases, they get to make that initial assessment. To me, the value of having these folks do the initial assessment, they have a particular strength with respect to mechanics liens. So a lot of these cases happen to be cases where a worker has added value to a building, a property. And there is a legal leverage point that workers and victims of wage theft can use, which is pretty effective, which is to put a lien on a property. That effectively is like I'm putting a note on this church, right? If I came here and built out a room and the church chooses not to pay me, right? I can put a lien on this church, which is a note on this church. So if anybody were to ever sell this church, they would have to resolve that note. And oftentimes the owner of the property, 10 out of 10 times, they don't want to have to deal with that note later. So that was a tool that this particular nonprofit of attorneys was able to use with hotel workers, right, that were able to remodel a hotel, is they threatened to put a lien on the entire hotel. You'd be amazed how quickly attorneys for the other side begin to converse with you, right? Whereas when we sent them the letter, you all recall that? They just wrote us a nice 3-sentence letter that says, you guys are barking up the wrong tree, we're not the bad guys, go away. So, if this image looks a bit confusing, it's meant to, right? Is that for a victim of wage theft, they look at a lot of this and they're like, it's not worth my time. But what I can say, and what Daniel can elaborate on, is that we're talking in the tunes of millions and millions of dollars, just in Colorado alone, and tens of millions nationally, right? So that's just money that's not going back in the economy. But I don't think about it in the macro sense. I think about it because of our exposure in the individual sense. This is money that's not paying for food, groceries, or diapers, whatever that is, rent. So finally, what I would say is Centro Humanitario. We are just part of, I think, a growing network. Centro Humanitario with Towards Justice, that they're the nonprofit that receives our cases, right? They're our allies. They can feed it cases either to us, they resolve their own cases, and then there are other partner attorneys that they would feed certain cases to. Myself, Daniel, help lead what's called a wage theft task force. We meet with the Department of Labor, Colorado Department of Labor, and a couple of other private attorneys that just continue figuring out how can we advance this issue on education, advocacy, right, and enforcement. What are other attorneys doing? What is working? What are some trends that we're beginning to see? From the Department of Labor, we want to know what numbers they're producing every year. And so those are the different routes that we're taking, but at Centro, so I'm going to go one layer deeper on Centro, right, is one of the things that I feel that Centro, the direction we're going in the future, is really one, just being more public about wage theft. There needs to be a lot more education in the Spanish community. We've gone big in Univision, Telemundo, Spanish media, to just try to educate folks that regardless of your status, you have recourse. The Department of Labor and the consulate have come out publicly and said so, right? Labor law is labor law. If you haven't been paid, regardless of status. So we are investing a lot of energy just to educate the community to come forward. And so we had a wage theft night at Centro, and we'll probably do one in northern Colorado, hopefully southern, and then hopefully even in Summit County, where a lot of compañeros, paisanos work in the hotel industry, ski industry. So advertising is big. The sort of special events like a wage theft night for the community is the second part. But the third part that I want to hand over to Chris and Mickey and Angela, and I very much appreciate their patience and their dedication, because it's pretty dynamic. We're learning as we go right now. But it's around direct action, right? It's around just cutting through all of this and just knocking on the door of an employer and saying, do you remember Pedro from last week? Right? Because he worked for you. You remember him, right? Would you like to pay him? Right? It's that simple, and what we hope to do, it's as simple as it sounds, right? I think that what we're learning is that it takes a lot of homework as well. And not just homework, but a training. And so I think that's part of what we're inviting you all to think about and join us in. But I'll cede the floor to compañeros, and you can describe what your experiences have been like, good and bad, in the context of direct action.
Okay. Well, I'll start because one of the first cases that we solved successfully was Alex, whose check bounced, which happens a lot of times, and that's a pretty common occurrence. And also, as we learn about the whole episode and the whole experience that these guys go through, guys and women, he presented the check to the bank. It bounced the first time, but they had stamped it already. So when he came back again to the bank, they thought he was committing fraud, and they scared him. And so he didn't want to go back to the bank anymore. And so the wage theft team who took on this case, you know, white, middle class, all we have to do, we realized that the check was still good. It hadn't been past 6 months, so we went to the bank. And they were a little taken aback by all of us. Alex and all of us went there. But once the manager saw us, brought us into a room, she understood the situation. She said, well, let's call up the employer right now. Let's see if he's got funds in the bank, because they didn't have any funds to cover that check. So as it turned out, the employer reissued a check that very day. We went to the employer, we picked up the check, we went back to the bank, and Alex got his money that day. And it made everybody feel good. But Alex was still left with having lost his car because he had 2 checks bounce. So even though he got his money, you know, it was a little late. But learning, every time we get a new case, we learn something new. So that was nice to have a relatively easy one.
Stories in this brochure too, but not the direct action successful follow-up, so we have to redo some of these.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you
But
go.
it was a long time, right? How long?
The thing about Alex, it's interesting,
Fall of 2012.
because Alex went through all of these paths
That's right.
before compañeras and compañeros came to the rescue. He went to the Colorado Department of Labor. They wrote him a letter that said, we can't do anything. We called the employer, and he doesn't in good faith want to negotiate, and this is as far as we can go. We called the employer, at Centro Humanitario, a couple of times, and sent a demand letter, non-responsive. Right, so he was trying to do the right thing here, Alex, and so I would say it was about 4 months from the time he first came to Centro to the time they were at a bank collecting some cash.
And the interesting thing was that he wrote a check out of a different bank account than the one that it bounced too. So we're all speculating, does he have two accounts? You know, ones he wants to bounce and ones that he wants to pay his employees.
Right.
I think what we've experienced is that doing a delegation visit can often be a productive step. The next step is some type of direct public action. And so our little wage testing team works with Marco to do a delegation visit to see if we can't talk to the person who is not paid the wages in a little more informal environment about how can we do something about this. And certainly, in this case, working with the bank where this company had its accounts and having the bank president call up and having the accountant there saying, excuse me, what is your position again? Oh, president of the bank. Okay, let me get back to you. That certainly played an important role, but it's the idea of going to the process of talking to people. So having people show up, explaining the situation with the person who's affected and saying, isn't there some way we can resolve this? We have found in other cases that this is also a very productive avenue. But then there are times when that doesn't work. And so with this particular case with a hotel, the lawyers began pressing them with this construction lien and whether anything was going to happen. Well, okay, they came back and said, well, here's a possible solution. Now remember, it's complicated because in today's world, you'll have a company who hires a general contractor who hires franchise people. And that's why this particular hotel said, us, they don't work for us. Go talk to the general contractor. Well, ultimately, it is the company's responsibility to make sure they have responsible general contractors and that they have subcontractors that are responsible. Well, in this case, they made a very meager offer that the workers said no to, and things are going along. And so the question came up, okay, at what point should we move toward more direct action? So I'll just mention to you the kind of thing that we did. And that's what's fun about this, because you actually learn a lot. So we developed a strategic plan that included, now I've covered over the name of the hotel because with the things are still working on that. Something it will all be covered. But in any event, having workers, allies, research, communication, materials, and action. And then by week, what's supposed to be done, so that we could move this whole thing forward. So we developed this strategic action plan. And one part of that was doing a scouting mission. Now, if you're going to do a direct action, you have to know certain things, like where is this place located? What's the security like system? Where are possible avenues for public action? And what do we know about how this hotel works? For example, for us, they had remodeled rooms. So the question was, well, could we get pictures of the rooms so that we could use that? Now, I have sign-up sheets here. First of all, the first case, the Grease Monkey case, the one that Angie talked about, we had written up. And if you'd like a copy, I can email it to you. And if you're interested, the Ruckus Society, I love the name, they have a scouting manual for activists. And this is what we used. Because they tell you all the things you need to think about and where to go and what to do. So we read this, we discussed it, and we went down to this hotel. And we went in and we followed their advice because they say take plenty of pictures. And so we took pictures of the outside of the hotel and where you might have a possible action. And then we went inside. And you can see this nice big area here where there's an opportunity because at 4 o'clock every day they have snacks and music. What a great time to have some kind of an action. So if you go in, they've got the check-in area here, and I couldn't find where the office was. It was like, we're going to meet the head of this place. Where do we go? Well, it turns out that behind, this is where the check-in folks are. And here's the check-in people. And it's behind the screen. Super locked door with only a combination. Well, that means it's going to be kind of hard for us can we see the president or general manager or whatever? So we had an idea of, okay, here's the outside, here's the inside, and we may not be able to get and see the general manager. Well, as fate would have it, when we were out there nosing around, the assistant manager came down and found me outside and said, "Oh, I hear you all are interested in the hotel and some rooms." And I was outside waiting for folks. And I said, "Oh, yes." And we chatted for a bit, and we bonded because he played college basketball, and I used to play college basketball. So we were bonding over our experiences and whatnot. And then he said, "You know, if you want more information, just have them call me and I'll come down. Here's my card." I thought, "Thank you very much." Now we have a contact so that if we would come there, we could say, "Can George so-and-so come down? We want to talk." And here we are. So we had laid out, found the place. We learned, when we went to the rooms, I mean, Mickey and Angie were so good in coming up with a story about how we were having relatives come and we wanted to have them stay at the hotel. Could we see rooms? Well, we saw all the rooms that these guys had fixed up, and we took pictures of it. So we had information as to what they had done. We had information about how it was laid out. We had information from them on how we could get a hold of the manager and when they have a little party. So we were thinking of various strategies because, you can demonstrate on the sidewalk, that's fine. But once you get into a hotel or a private property, you run into challenges and difficulties. So we had thought of a Alinsky-style strategy where we would have a group of 10 or 12 people with the workers with all our suitcases. And we'd come into the lobby and, okay, what are these people? And then unzip our suitcases and have all these signs, including fact sheets, and give them out at the time when they had their little cocktail party with the piano playing and whatnot, and then leave. So we sort of had in our heads a way we might capture attention. Of course, alerting press and other folks that this was going to go on. Well, as fate would have it, and we're very happy, it turns out that the hotel has made an offer that meets the original demand, and they're in the process of finalizing this, which is why we can't go into what hotel it is and so forth and so on. Well, I mention all this because the lesson that's emerged is that you need multiple strategies toward the target. Letters, requests, lawyers, and then some type of delegation, and if need be, moving toward another step. So you have to look at the array of strategies that focus on the target that would lead pressure so that they would change. And that's really what working with Marco and their attorneys, we're all about. And so next Thursday, we're going to get 5 more cases. We need more interested community people to help us, especially if they have Spanish skills. So I have here information. One is the Grease Monkey case. The other is the scouting manual from the Ruckus Society. And if you sign your name and give me your email, I'll send it to you. The other is, if you're interested in becoming involved with us, as your schedule allows. I mean, this is not, we're not asking anybody for a commitment because you know we got busy times. We usually meet at El Centro from 5 to 7 on Thursdays to go over cases and progress and whatnot. But if you're interested at some point in knowing more about what we're doing, we'll be glad to put you on the email list, let you know, and if it works with your schedule, then you can come out and have some fun. So at that point, let us turn to Dan Claywitter. Do my colleagues want to add anything?
No, that was fabulous.
Angie?
No.
So Dan can help us see the broader picture and also what's going on with the legislature and what it is we can do to help. And so turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, brother.
Okay.
So the direct action is the most fun stuff, right? Being able to make a difference and an immediate impact on workers. And the group, so FRESC stands for Front Range Economic Strategy Center. But nobody could remember that. They were calling us the Free Range Chicken Group down at the Capitol. But we're about a decade-old nonprofit that kind of does a lot of different things, but a lot of communications research, public policy, as well as organizing of larger coalitions. And the complicated graph there that Marco shared, that was actually developed by one of my colleagues at FRESC, Rachel Running, who, God bless her, we had a lot of meetings where I was trying to explain to her the stuff Marco and I had learned about all the different paths, and this was her attempt to kind of illustrate that. So I was hired on by FRESC about 6 years ago to really focus on forming an interfaith worker justice committee in Colorado attached with this national network in Chicago. So it's mostly been organizing other clergy from all different faiths, right, and using that perceived power to do the same things that Chris was talking about. We did a lot of direct action as well. We throw on our collars or our yarmulkes, whatever. And in fact, me and Reverend Ann Dunlap, we tried to help out a worker before Marco was on board at Centro, I think. We actually knew where the employer who had not paid the worker was at. We found his home address and we went there. And they would not answer the door. And so we wrote a nice little letter. They never responded to me or Reverend Ann, but they called up the worker and they said, if you continue to do this, we're going to report you to ICE. And they threatened him with deportation, which is something that sometimes a lot of fly-by-night employers will try to use. It's illegal to do that. It doesn't matter whether you're documented or not, right? You have to be paid for the work you perform.
And not only that, in our quarterly roundtable, ICE told us they would not respond to those.
Right. But the employers can still use it, right, to try to threaten a worker. Marco had mentioned that we had this wage theft task force. It's been about 3 years. Again, before Marco was on, another organizer at Centro, very similar stuff, right? Workers coming into El Centro, we're not getting paid. We're not having any success with the Department of Labor. And this organizer asked me, Reverend Daniel, will you put on your collar and try to get us a meeting with the Colorado Department of Labor? So I said, sure, that's a great use of the REV dot in front of my name. I'll do that. And we met, and gosh, lo and behold, the first year and a half, it was just like everybody trying to get to understand each other, right? Like how complicated this stuff is. Why the Colorado Department of Labor, even though they have money, why don't they have enforcement power? And so we discovered a lot of things, even the attorneys didn't know, right? Is that the Colorado Department of Labor has like 5-6 staff total to enforce all the state laws that they have. And they get over 30,000 calls a year. They think that roughly 5,000 or so are around wage theft, but they do not even have the computer technology to track that. So, one of our learnings was that it's not that the Colorado Department of Labor is filled with, evil bureaucrats that don't want to help workers. In some serious ways, particularly in resources, funding, and enforcement, they don't have the power to do that real well. So we've built up those relationships for a while. The direct action stuff is fun, but then the Wage Theft Task Force also came to realize is that the least fun part is also we have to look at a political solution, and it needs to be statewide. So this is the third year that we've worked in coalition with different folks to try to pass a statewide bill to curb wage theft in Colorado. And that bill's looked different, right? The first time it came up was through the DA's office in Boulder, trying to just very simply changing the criminal code in Colorado to really, right, so any employer, whether, depending on the amount of money, it would have been, it could be up to a felony, it could be a misdemeanor, depending on how much money was taken. Legislature was not friendly to that idea, and we were kind of doing this task force, and then we found out about this bill and said, well, we're coming late to the party, but we've been working on the issue. We'll be happy to help educate legislators about this
Well, you
issue.
weren't really coming late to the party, we were just, didn't know each other
Existed, but then we did, and now, look at all of us now. So now at this point, this third time around, Fresk has been, against our experience, sort of like making a coalition of coalitions of other organizations, or spearheading that with El Centro and some other groups on this executive committee, and Fresk has thrown in resources to really, really get like third time's the charm. This time is our hope. And it's hard, it's complicated as you see, and it's like you don't want to see how the sausage gets made, right? But that's what you do when you go to the Capitol. But one of the main things the bill will do will be actually give the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment real enforcement power and the ability to actually mediate disputes. So instead of just sending a letter, to El Centro or to the worker, just be like, the employer doesn't want to negotiate, I'm sorry, best of luck. Under this bill, now, the employer and employee actually could be in a room with the Colorado Department of Labor enforcement officer, and they try to work it out before doing any of those other routes. If the employer refuses, like some of these employers have done, they just try to ignore a letter from the CDLE. Under the new law, they won't be able to get away with, well, they could, but they're going to be fined. And it's at a certain amount of time, and then all that money goes back into a wage theft enforcement fund, just for the CDLE. So the bill does other things. I'm not going to get into like all the specifics yet, but there are some tweaks that we think, we've got 4 pieces. We're hoping we can get at least 2. But I think that's probably one of the most important ones. And it's also the one part of the legislation that the different business lobbyists, they haven't actually raised any ruckus about this at all. So we're keeping our fingers crossed. But I did want to say that, I got on this issue too because, again, I had a relationship with Centro, and it was because of where my heart was, and it was, mostly vulnerable immigrant workers, right, who were day laborers. However, it's important to know that this is also, this is a national problem, and it isn't just, workers, low-wage workers even. So Kim Bobo, who runs National Interfaith Worker Justice, do folks know about her book, Wage Theft in America? It's the crime wave no one talks about. So she wrote this book probably about a decade ago now, but she's testified in Washington, D.C., right, about this epidemic. And some of the things she lists is that, according to the Economic Policy Foundation, which is a business-funded think tank of HR executives, workers in the U.S. annually lose $19 billion in unpaid overtime alone. So these are like white-collar workers, right? 19 billion. New York State was losing up to $427 million of state revenue in 2010 because of lost income tax because employers not paying their workers correctly, right? Misclassifying workers as independent contractors when they're not, like taxi driver, right? So there are all different ways and other classes of workers besides day laborers that this is also happening to. Marco mentioned the restaurant industry. A 2001 U.S. Department of Labor study found 50% of restaurants in Pittsburgh, 74% of daycare centers in Georgia, 50% of nursing homes in St. Louis all had violated wage and hour laws. So home health care, right? Folks taking care of our loved ones. Those companies also often commit wage theft on their employees as well. So quite widespread. And then one thing I always have to say for the restaurant industry, one thing that each and every one of you can do is try to pay your servers in cash rather than adding on the tip on your credit card, because it's always a little bit easier for an unethical employer to take money away from waiters and waitresses. if it's just on that credit or debit card. But if you take that cash, hand it to your server, say thank you for serving, I appreciate it, then it's a little bit better that they'll be able to keep that. And then in terms of the bill, I think Chris is going to know where this is going because he comes to some of our coalition meetings. There's still negotiations going around, but really by January of this next year, we'll have the language finalized by the end of this month. It'll be really important for folks who are registered to vote to contact, right, your representatives and say, we need to pass this. It's really important that we find, I think we have a lot of wage theft victim stories to testify. We need more employers to come forward and say, look, I'm an ethical employer. And if the person, the other business guy or woman down the street who's in my same industry, if she's cheating her workers on purpose, that gives her an unfair advantage in the marketplace and it hurts my business. We need a lot more stories like that, right? And so we'll be really, really pushing for that come January. And we just wouldn't be here without all of us sort of having this past and knowing each other too. So I just want to say, we just wouldn't be doing this without Centro and the bravery of the workers themselves trying to solve their cases. So it's multi-level, multi-pronged. It can't be just one group or one, it's going to take all of us. And people of faith can really have an important voice in this legislative process to push it. So, thank you.
We've been from Seaver. We've been to see Morgan Carroll and also Irene Aguilar. And I think Irene is sympathetic to this, but I've forgotten.
Morgan's a strong champion, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are those two that we should work with?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're the places, the outside of Denver, they're going to be key, but any support that folks can give to your legislator, even if they're already friendly, like Morgan Carroll, that'll be important to give them some encouragement. It's important for them to be able to say, I got a handwritten letter or a phone call from my constituent, and they're supporting it. The MoveOn.org stuff is fine, but like Representative Jonathan Singer, a Longmont who's really been carrying the bill the last 2 times, has told other groups too, is that either a phone call or a handwritten letter is something that most legislators pay even more attention to. Particularly if you take the time out to handwrite, or he said actually even typing, but that can have a real difference. And with the recalls of a few legislators this last time around, this isn't a guaranteed thing. Even though the business community is like, okay, we think we've got a deal this time around and we understand this is a real problem, and it's not a done deal, so. But we need to do something to protect workers in the whole state, right? Not just in Denver or Aurora, because it's happening everywhere.
Yeah, the majority leader in the House and the majority leader in the Senate will both support this.
Yeah.
In fact, Raleigh offered to be a sponsor the first year if we didn't have one in the Senate.
Yeah, I'm feeling more optimistic, knock on wood, than I was the past 2 times. And if for no other reason that we've got so many more allies that are kind of focused on the bill this time around too.
Speaking of allies, quickly, one thing I would say, the opportunity for you to get involved and plug in. One is, it's a pretty textured and rich experience, I think, to get to know some of these folks, some of these workers. One of the first meetings that compañeros were at, Mickey and Chris and Angie, we had 14 construction workers show up that night, right? And to hear each of them describe the experience of getting paid cash out of a shoebox and then not get paid anything, and then to witness the owner of the company drive up in his new trucks. You just can't make that stuff up. So one is, by getting involved, there's a richness to these stories. However suffocating the despair seems, for me, it just fills you with some righteous indignation, right, to act. And then 2, I think that there's a value of being witness to some of this. Is it the testimony, if you are in the legislator's office, to say, right, I've actually worked on 10 different cases.
Right.
And so you're one more person who is amplifying an urgency that I think needs to be addressed. I want to recognize Bob, and he helped me a couple of weeks ago. We went down to a conference, the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition Conference, CIRC, and they prioritized 3 bills, legislative bills for the year. And so really what it was a speed dating setup where they had 5 rooms, And in each of the 5 rooms, they had 40 people. And we had to go into every one of the 5 rooms and make a case for why this should be one of their top 3. So Bob helped make that case. The fact that Cirque has taken this on as one of their top 3, it's going to give us a very strategic and statewide reach, because Cirque is made up of member organizations. What we're cultivating right now or developing with the Cirque organizers is a toolkit that each of these organizations can put into the field that will help collect stories. We'll give referrals to names of attorneys that are working on these, that are on standby. And we'll, give them instructions that call their legislators with these cases. So that is another dimension with respect to a united front component that is different than previous years. Compañera?
So I just learned that in hospitality, if you're in a hotel, it's better to tip the housekeeper every day, because if you tip when you leave, that might be a different person. So I just mentioned that. And they won't get the tip, so, a couple bucks a day. Secondly, over in these industrial areas, I live over there in the Globeville area, and we're noticing more and more short trip truckers are having their wages stolen. Individuals who have marginal licenses that are getting hired for produce delivery, for things like that. And it's amazing how people that are known in the area will do that. And then third, I wanted to ask you, is there any, I think this is somewhere in the country, but what about, is there an online registry of violators here, and could there be? And secondly, could there be like an alternating, here are the industries that are honorable, right next to the industries? I'm all for shaming this.
Right.
Is that at all an effective strategy?
It's been talked about. Nothing like it exists. I mean, it'd be a pretty heavy lift. Part of what Daniel alluded to with the Colorado Department of Labor is that they don't have the technology right now to single out or identify the multiple offenders, right? The employers that do it over and over and see it as a part of their business model. But I think that increasingly, what we want to do is understand where are the deficits in their data collection. That might be something that could get legislated, or working with or pushing the head of the Department of Labor is demanding that they start tracking that, right? We need to find the multiple employers, again, those who see it as a business model.
There is a website, I'm not going to remember, but I believe it's hosted by Working America, which is a community affiliate of the AFL-CIO, but they actually do have it, it's still up. If you just go to the Working America website, you may be able to find it somewhere, but they actually do have a place where you can input your zip code. And what it will show, it won't get down to the specifics. It won't be like that grease monkey committed wage theft, but it will show any fines that they've have been filed against them for it does break out by wage hour labor laws. So you actually can look, and I did try it once and was surprised. There were a lot of landscape companies in my neighborhood in North Park Hill that had been fined for some kind of wage and hour violation. So it won't tell you that they committed wage theft, but it lets you know that they either did that or they weren't paying Social Security on their worker or something, right? Or their workers' women's class, whatever. But yeah, Marco's right. I mean, the DOL, I've been in some of the meetings there, and they'll have computers that were new, but because it was a messed up funding story, they can't even take them out of the box. It's really, really rough. But part of what the bill will do again, right, is actually get them some money from to at least start to be able to enforce the laws that they're supposed to be enforcing.
Yeah, to go back to Marco, you're talking about speed dating. I had the privilege of counting votes.
Of counting the votes?
In some of the organizations that had other issues up, they put wage stuff first. And I had a couple of other organizations like CFR said, no matter how this comes out, we're gonna work on it. So there's a lot of support there that didn't really maybe show up on the surface.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, all the issues are important. It was a great weekend to hear about those different issues.
I wanted to ask several questions about the prospective legislation and your view of this. The bill last year had criminal penalties as a part of it, and there seemed to be very strong business opposition, and that seemed that was dropped from this bill. So then the question is, well, what's the teeth in the bill? Now, you've mentioned that maybe the Department of Labor would be able to bring people together in a room, and if they didn't, they'd fine. But then that's the question of how much staff do they have. One reason business might say, oh yeah, I support that, is they get 5,000 complaints and they got 3 people working on it and nothing ever happens. And so one question is the enforcement and the trade-offs, and where in this bill is there something that's strong.
Right.
The second question is, I think last year, the situation was, if the person alleged wage theft and they went to court, if they lost, they would have to pay, or there was something in there that was just backwards from what you normally think.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering where that situation is.
Mm-hmm.
And then the issue of the amount of time that employees had to file.
Right.
And how oftentimes they miss that deadline. Could you speak to those 3 things
Sure.
to help us understand
Sure.
the plus side of this bill?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so the criminal part, is just, it was a no-go, right? The first time, the second time, and if we led with criminal, if the coalition led with criminal in there now, it wouldn't be taken seriously, it'd be dead again. This is that sausage part, right? It's because when we first did it, right, when that's all it was just the criminal, right? I was there in my collar, I'm like, if you're not doing anything wrong, what's the problem? But that was a no-go. But the enforcement for the CDLE, so they would have the power to issue statutory penalties and collect fines. So it's not just like we now have the power to bring you in a room, it's also we have the power to fine you if you're an employer who's intentionally committing wage theft. So there's a monetary disincentive, right, for employers to keep on committing wage theft.
Will they have enough staff to do that? Are you proposing that they get more staff?
The funding that would hopefully come through that, right? So again, they would be getting money from additional resources that they don't have now from the state. And then any fines that they collect from those employers who aren't responding to them go back into this enforcement fund. So they, right, realistically, in Illinois had a state law similar to this. The first year, it's not like you ramp up $1 million and you can hire like 20 staff, right? You start with, but it escalates, right, over time.
Do they have people in those positions that are sympathetic to this? You can have a bureaucracy that says,
Yes.
yeah, we're just not going to worry about
Yes, I've never seen, I think I can say, the Colorado Department of Labor, I mean, they can't, because of their status, right, they can't like run around and say, we're for this bill. But they know that this will help them enforce it.
And you know the people, so.
Yeah.
Because the question is, well, is this a sufficient
Right.
stick to lead people who wanted criminal penalties to support this bill? And what you're saying is, yes, it is.
Right. Well, I think everybody's gonna have to decide that for themselves, but what I'm saying is if you like criminal, then good for you, run a bill. But we're not going to put our effort into that. The executive committee.
Well, I mean, even our legislative allies have just said, we can do it, but it's just dead on arrival.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you want to make some progress and get a couple of these things advanced? It's kind of like a poison pill at this point, that we would get nothing.
And then the 60-day piece, right, is still being talked about as an element of the bill. So under current law, employees who experience wage theft are supposed to present this written demand, right, within 60 days after, I guess, leaving the job or completing the job. Sometimes,
The last day.
the last day that they work, a lot of times employees don't discover that they've been victimized by their employers wage theft till after that 60 days. And the 60 days is like to collect penalties, right, additional penalties.
If they were to prevail in court, then a
Yeah.
judge would
Right.
tack on additional penalties. But if they didn't give that employer notice within those 60 days, then they're not eligible for it.
So this whole 60-day thing is an anomaly in Colorado, right? As far as we were able to do some research. Kim Bobo, who came to talk to a lot of us, 2 years ago, last time around, said she had never heard of this in her life. And so we're just trying to get rid of that requirement, right? Just get rid of that 60 days and just change it to, if you discover you're a victim of wage theft, if you do end up deciding to take your employer to court, you just have to give your employer 14 days notice that you're going to do that. But you do not have to file.
To try and work it out.
To try and work it out. And that that seems to still be kind of on track, I think, to be in there. Yeah, the attorney fee issue is really, really complicated. We could always bring an attorney back here to talk about it. But yeah, this was like a Supreme Court case that kind of got interpreted strangely. But under current law, for wages over $7,500, the judge can mandate that the prevailing party in a case pay the attorney's fees of the losing party. Under our current language, a judge would only be able to award attorney's fees to the winning plaintiff. This is also being followed on a different track actually right now by some of our attorney friends on the Wage Theft Task Force, because a guy who was a victim of wage theft won his case in court, but the judge interpreted current law to say, well, your case is different enough that I don't think that the employer should have to actually pay your attorney fees. I think his wages that he won was like $5,000 or something, maybe a little bit less, but his attorney fees were more than that. So you would have a case of a worker, right? You can imagine the chilling effect this is going to have on a worker. Oh, I can go. I'm owed like $5,000, but right, some attorneys charge $200-300 more an hour. It's ridiculous. No, attorneys won't take the cases now, and workers won't bring them forward. So there's actually an amicus brief has been filed to try to get rid of this separate from our bill. But the bill does still have language in there to try to address the situation Chris mentioned, because it's weird. It's very, very weird. But we may not need our bill and our language to solve it. So that's being worked out through the courts now in this alternate way. And did that answer all your questions?
Well,
Or was
yeah,
I missed one?
thank you. I'm
Yeah.
going to bring it up because as it goes along,
Yeah.
you're going to hear something
Yeah.
about criminal penalties and filing deadlines and all this other stuff. So this is very helpful to see the positive side of what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate it.
I don't want to in any way undermine the value and importance of achieving some sort of legislative victory here. But equally as important, what I'm seeing for the future, these next coming years, is just holding these institutions accountable. And really just trying to use what is on the books already, right? There are any number of huge penalties that employers can incur if they commit wage theft. The question is, how do you get an employer, hold them accountable, whether it's in a small claims court. And so I think that, again, what you're probably going to walk out of this room with is sort of this sense of the interplay between enforcement and then policy. They really do support each other. So even if we were to win these things, I don't think it's a panacea to wage theft, right? At the end of the day, it's going to be how our employers held accountable. And what you're suggesting, Chris, is that how do you make it so unappealing for an employer? They understand that the cost of committing wage theft isn't worth, right? Ripping people off. So that's where I think we got to go. The last example I'll give you is the city of Denver does have a wage theft ordinance under petty theft for anything under $1,000. And that's kind of a sweet spot. That's actually where some of our cases are at, under 1,000. And what I hope to do as part of our own evolution is to really meet with the police chief and meet with the officers and investigators that deal with economic crimes, and really establish a clear pipeline to say these cases are going to come at you, right? As they're coming to Centro, as we vet them, right? We're going to do our homework, but you should know that they're going to come to your front door, and we want to know what you guys are going to do about it. Will the city, right, which is responsible for enforcing its laws, will the city attorney actually take these? Unfortunately, Mike McCarroll, who is with the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, they actually had a case, and they did all the homework, right? And they even put a nice red ribbon on it and took it to the district attorney's office and said, here's a great case. And the DA didn't want to take it, right? So they exercise discretion on the kinds of cases they take. But I really think that it will take agitation from community to say this is an important issue in our community. You should be prosecuting this, right? So there are just multiple dimensions to this. I don't want to romanticize it, but I think that I feel more comfortable getting into these waters when I know that we got a team,
Yeah.
right? Because initially, when I first came on Centro, I thought, right, this is where you learned a lesson, but I thought, yeah, just come on and we'll take your cakes and then we'll move it, right? We'll just call the employer, but then these things accumulated quickly. We realized that employers who've done this before know what the game is, and it's gonna take an equal amount of organizing, right, to combat some of that stuff, so.
Mhm.
Thanks again, Chris, for setting this up and making,
Yeah.
having this year.
Yeah, and thanks for everything that you've already done. I mean, particularly with Centro, it's awesome.
Can I ask another question? My wife and I go to a fundraiser dinner for a hospital. And I think it may be the hotel that you're talking about. If they're ripping off the employees, can you go to the hospital and say, you know, you might want to think twice about holding your fundraiser here?
That's clearly a strategy. We're not there at this point, so I appreciate you offering that strategy. But that's clearly a strategy, right? Is that you come around and you, what I think that with Rutgers Society probably identifies too, is you identify what are the pressure points. There may be a hotel that doesn't care if there are 400 people, and they should, but there's some hotels that, yeah, they're gonna make noise and they're gonna go away. But they do care if this big convention is threatening to move their convention across the street, they don't resolve it. And I think that's in fact how the newest Hyatt that was across from the convention center, the Democratic convention was coming to town. And labor was like, we want you to sign a neutrality, an organizing neutrality. And if workers want to form a union, we want neutrality from you all. And they were able to exact that from the person, so. Great strategy. The one thing Chris did mention, but is it just as important, and I want to be clear to everybody, is that we do believe in escalation, obviously, right? So what we had hoped to do was to, with the workers, go to the management of the hotel and say, are you going to solve this or not? We would rather resolve it here than resolve it in a public sphere and give them that opportunity. So there may be some not strange, but unique situations where you just jump all the way and go straight to direct action. But I think that, you know, again, that's why meeting as a group, we assess what the different escalations.
Last year's dinner was at that Hyatt, and they made $1.3 million at that dinner.
Right?
Well, remind you that there are brochures and information here, and if you would like copies of anything, just sign your name with the email, and we'll send out materials to you. And we're happy to keep you informed if you want to sign the list. That if my schedule permits, maybe I could be involved. So we welcome more people, especially since we're getting 5 more cases next Thursday, and we can use good people.
You did a great write-up job on my Grease Monkey case, by the way.
Yeah, I came over here because I'm on the immigration task force at the Unitarian Fellowship in Lafayette.
Yeah.
And we're getting to be more of an activist group, but I had hoped some of my task force members would have come here today, but I will take this back to them and see what we can do up
We
there.
got a traveling show here.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you all.